Hello and welcome to the third episode of the European Conservatives podcast, Brussels and Beyond, a podcast designed to keep you in the loop about the political wheelings and dealings that are happening here in Brussels and also in the capitals of Europe. My name is Zoltán Kottas. Portugal is heading to parliamentary elections on Sunday. The elections were called early after veteran Socialist Prime Minister António Costa announced his shock resignation following a corruption scandal. While the centre-right Democratic Alliance is set to win the polls, followed by the Socialists in second, the big shock of the day could be caused by right-wing Chega, which could receive as much as 20% of the votes, more than doubling its result of 2022. Chega was founded in 2019 by former sports commentator André Ventura, who has promised to clamp down on corruption and to restrict immigration. In an exclusive interview with the European Conservative, André Ventura told my colleague Álvaro Peñas that the reason for their success was Portuguese people's disenchantment with the poor performance of the traditional parties. These parties, Ventura said, have exhibited a total lack of response to issues such as uncontrolled immigration, the lack of security, and the disaster of public policies such as health, social security, and education. To read what the party leader had to say about why he decided to enter politics and whether the parties on the right could form a coalition, I encourage you to read our fascinating interview. My colleague Thomas O'Reilly has written about fresh plans from the European Commission to grant Brussels extensive new powers to centralise defence spending. But the idea seems to be even too much for Europhile member states. If the centralists have their way, we will have an EU army tomorrow with an EU defence minister and EU headquarters all under the umbrella of NATO. Harald Wilimski, Austrian member of the European Parliament for the National Conservative Freedom Party, told the European Conservative. Thomas, what exactly are the plans being discussed?
Well, this is not the first announcement made regards defence expenditure, especially in the aftermath of the Ukrainian war. But potentially this is an opening salvo for the next 5 years of EU militarisation as promised by Commission officials such as Ursula von der Leyen. What was announced was a procurement plan to enable European militaries to procure 40% of their collective arsenals collectively by 2030. Now this figure is set to rise. It's been unusually criticised both from the left, centre and the right. Also the usual critiques on the left regarding sort of empowering defence contractors. There was reports in the Financial Times about a lot of dissatisfaction among German industrialists who feel Brussels is simply incapable of managing Europe's collective security. But definitely something that is going to define the next 5 years of European politics as we see sort of green politics and green policies put to a side as the European Union scrambles for militarization. Now, it's to be decided whether this project is to be partially financed through frozen Russian assets. That's a decision that has to go through the European Council, but definitely a shot in the arm for EU militarization. Whether Brussels and bureaucrats are capable to manage that new burden is something to be seen.
Which countries are opposing the new plans and why?
Yeah, so rather surprisingly, it's not just Hungary taking the lash for this. You've seen a lot of this quiet among fiscally conservative nations, most notably Germany. We even saw comments by certain Green MEPs saying that it's too much. You've seen a good deal of criticism in the private sector, saying that Brussels is simply too slow, too off the mark. NATO does it anyway. It should be mentioned that per this week's announcement, this is all to be done in cooperation with NATO. Austrian officials I spoke to expressed a dissatisfaction that effectively neutral countries or non-NATO aligned countries such as Ireland, Austria, Malta are being brought into NATO by the back door. But yeah, it's a wide-ranging sort of dissatisfaction around the policy of common procurement of arms from Eurosceptics to left to right, and especially in the private sector. The consensus outside of the European bubble is that Europe or the EU specifically cannot handle Europe's defence expenditure. And to a large extent, these announcements are just cosmetic, and the real work will be done in the private sector, in the member states, and certainly in NATO.
Thomas, thank you very much. French President Emmanuel Macron's shocking comments from last week, saying that sending European ground troops to Ukraine cannot be ruled out, are still making waves in Europe. As Rafael Pinto Borges, the founder and chairman of Nova Portugalidade, a Lisbon-based conservative think tank, writes in his commentary for the European Conservative, and I quote, "Were NATO countries to place their military forces within Ukraine, it seems unavoidable that they would be engaged by Russia. Such an event, of course, would lead to public outcry in the West, in all likelihood to the activation of NATO's Article 5, and probably immediate retaliatory strikes against Russian targets. The escalation to a full-scale war would then become hard, if not impossible to stop. The scenario proposed by Emmanuel Macron would lead directly to a nuclear war in the heart of Europe." Rafael Pinto Borges states that Macron's comments stem most likely not from the desire to wage war against Russia, but more likely to frighten Russia, as Western capitals have come to the realization that Ukraine is losing the war. However, instead of sending shivers down Putin's spine, Macron has caused a Europe-wide panic. It is becoming clear that there is no mood in Europe for further involvement and to continue assisting Ukraine. It was not only Macron's words that caused furor in Europe, but also a leaked conversation between high-ranking German military officers in which they discussed a hypothetical attack on the Russian-held Crimea-Kerch bridge in Ukraine. The discussion was probably hacked by Russian spies after one of the German generals used an unsecured phone line at a Singapore hotel to join the conference call. Apart from talking about the possibility of sending and using German-made Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine, the officers claimed that British troops are on the ground in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the recording itself is enough to prove the direct involvement of the collective West in the conflict in Ukraine. But what was more striking than the actual military implications of the affair was the fact that sensitive information was so easily seized by Russia. Former UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said Germany is pretty penetrated by Russian intelligence, so it just demonstrates they are neither secure nor reliable. Security expert Frank Umbach claimed pro-Russian tendencies in Germany were always stronger than elsewhere, and the fear from abroad is that Germany's ministries are riddled with spies. Hungary will not back outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte's candidacy for the top job at NATO, Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó announced on Tuesday. Despite over two-thirds of NATO member states backing Rutte to replace Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg after the end of his term in October, Rutte still needs to convince around 10 mostly Eastern and Central European members to have unanimous support. Rutte has spent the last couple of years insulting the Hungarian government and advocating for kicking Budapest out of the EU, writes my colleague Tamás Orbán. He advocated for Hungary to be forced to its knees after the Hungarian parliament passed a child protection law prohibiting any propaganda linked to sexual identity from being portrayed in elementary schools and primetime TV programs. Rutte's comments may have cost him the job, but there are several alternatives waiting in line. I interviewed Tamás Deutsch, a member of the European Parliament for 15 years, who has been chosen as the lead candidate for the ruling Hungarian Conservative Party Fidesz in the upcoming European elections. Tamás Deutsch told me that one of the biggest issues to dominate European politics following the elections will be the continued attacks by the decision makers in Brussels against the sovereignty of member states. As he said, and I quote, "One of Brussels' main aims is to diminish, limit, and to take away the member states' sovereign decision-making rights by every means possible. This is a sovereignty-decreasing, empire-building aspiration that seeks to transform the European Union into a European empire, a superstate." Tamás Deutsch said if the EU came into existence now and took on its current form, none of its current member states would want to join. To read what he had to say about the farmers' protests, the rule of law debate, and what impact right-wing parties could make following the elections, go to our website, europeanconservative.com. Migration to Europe is rising on a massive scale, according to the latest figures by the European Union Agency for Asylum. A staggering 1.14 million people filed asylum claims in the European Union, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and Liechtenstein in 2023. This is an increase of 18% compared to the previous year and is the highest number since the height of Europe's migrant crisis in 2015-2016. Germany once again received by far the most asylum applications, recording 334,000 asylum seekers. Behind Germany were France and Spain, but per capita, Cyprus and Austria received the highest number of applications. Migration will certainly be a key issue at this year's European elections. My colleague from London, Mick Hume, has been writing about the hypocrisy of Western leaders who have been calling for Israel to pause its offensive against the terrorist Palestinian group Hamas, which brutally massacred 1,200 Israeli civilians and kidnapped 200 people during their raid of Israel on October the 7th. While Hamas and its supporters around the world are chanting "from the river to the sea," effectively threatening the Jewish state with genocide, Israel is being told to refrain itself by, among others, US President Joe Biden. Mick, in your column you write that this is more than just a war, it is an existential battle. Why is that?
Well, Zoltan, it's an existential battle in the first place for Israel. The existence of the Israeli state is on the line. Everybody in Europe now who is calling for a ceasefire, and we should recognise that the foreign policy spokesman for the EU, Borrell, boasts that 26 out of 27 EU states signed up to a recent call for a humanitarian ceasefire, as they call it. I think Hungary was the only one that didn't. A ceasefire means surrender from Israel's point of view. Hamas has no interest in a lasting peace with Israel. It is dedicated to the destruction of the Israeli state. Its slogan, "from the river to the sea," which is repeated by Islamists and their useful idiot friends on the left in the cities of Europe, in London every weekend, means basically the destruction, wiping Israel off the face of the earth and driving the Jews of Israel into the Mediterranean Sea. So it's an absolute existential war for them. Hamas has made it clear that if they get the opportunity, they will repeat the October the 7th pogrom and massacres, quote, again and again and again. So Israel has no scope for peace with Hamas or ceasefire. That's a call for them to surrender. That's in the first instance, in the immediate sense. So the point I'm making is also that it's a civilizational battle for us in the West. It's a question of saying, whose side are you on? Tom Stoppard, the British Jewish playwright, made the point after October the 7th that, we should consider that this is no longer just about territory, i.e. about whether there's a Palestinian homeland, which, by the way, Hamas is not fighting for a Palestinian homeland, it's fighting for a global caliphate. But he said we should consider it's not just about territory, it's about civilizational barbarism. And that's really what we're facing. And we've got barbarians inside the gates of the West here today.
So that's why Europe should take heed when witnessing this civilizational battle in the Middle East.
This is why Europe should stand foursquare with Israel. Instead of which, having tried to make the right noises in the first place, the EU has been retreating ever since and is now very close to abandoning Israel altogether. Some EU members, notably, such as Belgium and Ireland, are more or less on the Palestinian side completely in this conflict. And it's a real retreat from our own. We are abandoning the only Jewish state on earth, which for some reason is held to higher standards in war than other countries. I wonder why that might be, that the only Jewish state on earth is singled out. It's a sign of the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Western society, and the only democracy in the Middle East. And if we believe in our own democratic civilized standards, we should be standing foursquare with Israel, instead of which our leaders are retreating from the battlefield at exactly the moment when Israel needs them most.
You mentioned that these pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protests are ongoing in London. So it's since the October.
Yeah.
What kind of effect has this had on British politics?
Well, if you look at that remarkable debacle in Parliament a couple of weeks ago, where they were voting on ceasefire proposals from the Scottish National Party. The Speaker of the House, basically the Chairman of the House of Commons, tore up all the rules and allowed the Labour Party to put forward their ceasefire proposal in order for Labour MPs to show that they were on the side of Palestinians and a ceasefire, in order to stop them being attacked by Islamists in the streets. That was his own justification for why he'd done it, for the safety of MPs. Meanwhile, outside, the pro-Palestinian protesters projected the slogan "From the river to the sea" onto the tower that's known around the world as Big Ben, the symbol of British democracy. Became basically a Hamas propaganda graffiti outlet, and the police just, completely against the law, and the police just stood around and watched them and enjoyed the show. So we have basically the mother of all parliaments in Westminster reduced to this kind of quivering jelly of fear by the pro-Palestinian, in the face of these pro-Palestinian protests. I think that's a terrible thing for democracy in London, never mind in Israel and the Middle East. And it shows you that this is really not just about, as I say, defending the only democracy in the Middle East. It's about standing up for our own democratic values here in the West.
Mick, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Former US President Donald Trump easily won primary elections for the Republican Party on Tuesday, beating his only remaining rival Nikki Haley in 15 out of 16 states. Haley dropped out of the race soon after, paving the way for a rematch of the 2020 presidential election, which means Donald Trump versus Joe Biden this November. In his analysis, my colleague Sven R. Larsson writes, and I quote, "There is no doubt that Trump's loyal voter base is as enthusiastic about him now as they were in the past two presidential elections. Judging from the inability of other candidates to make a dent in the former president's lead in the opinion polls, it also looks he has added voters who were previously lukewarm or directly opposed to him." Sven R. Larsson adds that Trump has a significant chance of winning in November if he gets out of all the legal battles he is facing unscathed, and he can maintain a statesman-like manner and focus his speeches on policies. And that concludes the third episode of Brussels and Beyond. Don't forget to read our magazine, check out our website, subscribe to our Twitter, Facebook and YouTube channels, and watch our monthly TV show, Inside Brussels. Hope you tune in again next week. Have a very good week. Bye-bye.